last number of years, we have seen a terrible level of police violence against unarmed people in the minority community.
But we also have a police violence problem, a police brutality problem, a problem with the police use of excessive force.
Police brutality in our country is a disease that needs to be cured.
Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, joined by my co-host Sean Kennedy. Today, we are going to talk about a really super important topic to law enforcement generally, and in particular, I think to law enforcement officers. So in the last, 10, you could probably argue longer number of years, there's been a big push by certain politicians, celebrities, and many other prominent public voices, really pushing a narrative about law enforcement and making it appear that incidents of excessive force and especially improper uses of deadly force that I think range anywhere from people who want you to believe it's commonplace that law enforcement officers use deadly force. Some people want you to believe that law enforcement officers use deadly force in a way that's racist. Like where shootings of unarmed Black Americans are common. They happen all the time, that it's dangerous to go out in public if you're a Black American, especially if you're going to be having interactions with law enforcement. And you hear these things all over the place. And I mean, especially it reached a fever pitch in 2020. That's when we saw all of this coming out. We saw members of Congress making crazy, irresponsible statements. Many other public leaders, by the way, too, mayors, governors, celebrities, just all manner of people saying things that were just completely irrational and untrue. And that's the point of today's podcast. We're going to show how all of this, all this rhetoric is just untrue. And we're going to do it based on facts, which is how we like to do things. We look at actual facts. And that's where Sean is going to come in, is that we put out a report, the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, in August of 24 called Fatal Falsehoods. And the whole idea of the report was to take some of those narratives and that political rhetoric and then supply facts based on data. And that Sean did the research for this report. And so we're going to step kind of one by one through our Fatal Falsehood report. And we're going to take what people think, and then we're going to interject facts and see how that changes things.
Well, it's good. It's good to be here and talk about something that, as you said, is so vital, not only to law enforcement, but really to what we do in the public safety realm, which is talk about what policing really is and how public perceptions are being warped by false narratives promoted by people in power. I mean, not only politicians, but as you said, celebrities, people who have a soapbox are getting up there and maligning the profession of law enforcement as some kind of brutal, racist, terrible, gang of thugs. And that's almost exactly what Nancy Pelosi had said after George Floyd. She said that these are brutal and racist, and there's an epidemic of police violence. All of that inflamed rhetoric led to support for radical policies, and those policies are at odds with reality. And to your point, let's walk through 5 myths about law enforcement that we looked at the data. And the first one is police often use force. The next is police use disproportionate and excessive force. The third is that police shootings are very common, and we see this in the polling amongst the American public, that they think these are dime a dozen. The police are just shooting up the place. And then that the police are shooting unarmed people at frequency. And that the final one, obviously, which links to Floyd, even though Floyd was killed not with a firearm, is that police shootings are racist. All 5 of those are overwhelmingly believed by the majority of the public. And if certain subsets believe them at disproportionate rates, if you control for people's ideology, very progressive, very liberal people believe fantasies, just complete fantasies. It's not... You can even come to believe that that these things are, being massaged, or this data is nuanced. 1,000 unarmed Black people are not being killed annually in the United States by police. But that's exactly what a poll by Skeptic Magazine in 2021 found, that Black liberals believe that 1,000 unarmed blacks are being killed a year, and that the police are killing 10,000 unarmed people a year, or armed total people a year, which is just
It's
totally
absurd.
out of whack.
It's crazy.
And those myths have done that. So the first thing let's get down and break into is police use of force. Jason, why don't you talk us through, before we get into the data, what police use of force is, and then we'll talk about what the studies and data actually show.
Yeah, so I mean, a police use of force, it can be relatively minor. I mean, it can be as simple as, somebody resists arrest. They're told they're under arrest and to, comply with handcuffing, and someone doesn't comply with handcuffing, and it requires a police officer to use some level of force to get their arms behind their back to get them into handcuffs. It could also be someone is resisting arrest and attempting to fight officers by punching, kicking, pushing. The officer uses like pepper spray or uses a taser or a baton. These are all non-lethal force. I mean, these are levels of force that are just intended to gain compliance. It's not a life or death situation. It is a way to protect the officer's safety and also to vindicate the officer's proper legal right to place a person under arrest, or to protect the public. They usually don't result in injuries, as you'll, I'm sure, get into. These are minor uses of force. It's just a way of gaining compliance with a lawful order, which is usually to submit to being placed under arrest. That's what a use of force is. And of course, deadly force is a use of force as well. But I think we're probably going to, just at first, we're just going to talk about general uses of force and how often those come up.
Yeah. So when we talk about use of force, we're talking about direct contact with another individual, either with a weapon in the case of both the firearm or a non-lethal weapon, or hands or whatever. That is use of force. There are two very important pieces of data out there that were done by research, one by a professor at the University of Wake Forest, who's not only an emergency room physician, but an epidemiologist. He studies sort of the sociology and the spread of some of these different social phenomena related to health. And he studies police use of force by going and looking at 1 million 911 calls. That's 1 million police 911 calls, not fire or ambulance. And when the police show up, he then analyzed what happened next. And when he went through it, this is at 6 different large police agencies across the country over a large period of time, North Carolina, Arizona, all these other places. He goes through it and he finds something I think really shocking, that only 1/10 of 1% of all police encounters involve any use of force. So if you're encountered by somebody in a 911 situation, the odds the police are going to touch you are so low, it's unbelievable. 99.9% of the time, there is no use of force. And as we said, we described what use of force looks like.
These are just even a very minor physical coercion between an officer and another person. Using a push to create distance, using any sort of effort to put a person's arms behind their back if they're being placed. All of these are considered uses of force. And that only happens 1/10 of 1% of the time for 911 calls, where police are respond to an emergency 911 call.
And there's a similar study, but with a different methodology, but it comes to the same conclusion by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is a nonpartisan office. These data that we're looking at is from 2015 and 2020 and so forth. And in that data, 2018, 2015, so this is Obama's DOJ and Biden's DOJ and all these other stuff. They come out with a study at intervals, and that study about police use of force, the number is infinitesimal. It's a fraction of a percent of people have some real use of force against them. According to that study, it's 1% of people who are encountered by the police in a street stop or whatever. Same again?
You're talking about situations in which
Proactive policing.
Right,
I mean, some of it involved. It's combined with some 911 calls, but it's like, did you encounter the cops? Did the cops come up to you on the street? Did they stop you? Did they whatever? And of those, less than 1% had any use of force, whether it be a shove or anything like that, used against them to gain compliance. And so that is what the professor at Wake Forest says, Dr. Bozeman. He succinctly says it in his abstract. Officers most commonly rely on unarmed physical force and non-lethal weapons, and significant injuries are rare. And that gets us into the second part of both the Bozeman study and the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Department of Justice data, is that when police use force, as Jason was saying, it's minor force. It's just to gain a modicum of compliance. Hey, get up against the car. You kind of resist. He pushes you a little to get you into the cuffs. It's not a savage beating on the side of the road a la Rodney King or anything like this, where we perceive these sort of brutal incidents are just happening on a daily basis to unsuspecting motorists or people just, minding their own business. So what he also shows, the Bozeman study, and it's important because, again, he's an emergency room physician and professor. He said that only 11% of those calls result in arrest, but only 0.086%, as I said, less than 0.1% result in force. But of all of those, only 0.0015. That means 99.9% of all use of force incidents result in no injury. So the pushing, the shoving, the whatever, that means people aren't being hospitalized. People aren't being injured beyond recognition. There's no shooting. There's no firearm involved whatsoever. These are simple things. And so in most cases, even the use of a taser or whatever would result in, you'd say, a moderate injury or whatever would classify. So you're not even looking at non-lethal weapons in that sense, beanbag rounds or whatever, being used very commonly at all. They're very rare that these things are even being deployed to gain compliance. And as we said, they're non-lethal. They're not trying to kill you. They're trying to subdue you so that you don't harm yourself or you don't harm others, you don't harm them, and they end the situation safely.
Very, very rarely do police use force of any kind. And the really overwhelming majority of the time that they do use minor force, it doesn't even result in any sort of injury whatsoever. So the number of even minor injuries that result from police uses of force make up a very tiny, tiny, tiny percent of the overall number of encounters that law enforcement officers have with individuals in the community.
Exactly. The odds you're going to be injured by the police in any given police encounter are infinitesimal. The odds you're going to be killed are even more rare. And other studies show it's not even resisting arrest per se, as much as there's at least attempted violence against the police, or there's a threatening movement or situation where the police proactively use force to end the situation. And again, that force is limited and proportional. It is not excessive in 99.99% of cases. And that all goes to the point here that we're looking at a narrative that is just downright false. And when you look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics data, when you look at this Bozeman study and other studies done by professors at Harvard and Princeton and University of Michigan, all these studies have come out and they just get ignored because they don't like the conclusion in the media. They don't like the conclusion amongst activists. And so if the conclusion doesn't fit their pre-existing narrative, the data is just to be ignored because the data can't be undermined. It's there. It's the data has to be ignored because it doesn't fit what they want it to say.
So let's get down to it. In these narratives, one of the big problems is obviously it impacts public opinion. It makes people think that the problem is something way different than what it is, and that results in bad policy and many other things that come from that. But what are those perceptions? So in 2021, AP poll showed that 45% of Americans agree that police violence against the public is an extremely or very serious problem. And that was an increase. So in 2015, a poll showed it was 32%. So it was a roughly 25% increase in people thinking it's an extremely big problem. They're all influenced by the media narratives they're hearing. In 2023, Morning Consult poll showed 75% believe police violence is a very or somewhat serious problem. The concern is not in line with the data and the facts at all.
And multiple polls have been done about this. But there was a poll done a few years ago, and it was the partisans' perceptions and the overall perceptions of the change in police shootings, how frequent and common they are. And they asked people, and Democrats said that there are more police shootings since 2020, in the last year, 2020, 2021, than there were in prior years. 64% of Democrats thought that. And 40% of independents, and even 16% of Republicans thought that stuff. But in fact, it had gone down yet again. And if you go back further in time, and this is the striking thing, there were almost 100 people in a year killed just in New York City by NYPD in 1971. By 2019, that number was 9. There are 8 million people living in New York City. And so what part of it is that there's better data, that people are tracking it and all these other stuff. But places where they were tracking it, it was much more common. Police are less likely to use deadly force than they were before, at least in New York City, from what we know. And we know that in other contexts, it has gone down dramatically, other types of use of force. We'll have a whole episode about body-worn camera and the push for that and sort of the deep, irony about what the body-worn camera push showed about policing. But there is this perception. We actually did our own poll, LELDF did a few years ago, and it showed exactly the same perceptions, which is that the number of unarmed people killed by police is very common. The number of people killed overall by police is astronomical. Skeptic Magazine found the same thing.
You're saying that's what people think.
That's what the American people's perception is, which is driven by the media narrative and the public officials who are repeating it. Like we heard at the beginning of the podcast, there's this desire to manifest this racist, brutal murder machine that is the law enforcement in America narrative, and it's rubbing off on the average American, and that's very dangerous, both for public trust in policing, but obviously when people encounter the police and they think the police are likely to hurt them, their reaction is different than their perception that the police are not likely to hurt them. If you're tensed up and you think the guy behind the badge in front of you is going to hurt you, your reaction is going to be different than if you think that guy is going to, give you a citation instead of a strong beating and whatever.
I can tell you for sure, Sean, that's what's happening. And listeners might be thinking, okay, so people don't understand the actual facts. What's new about that? There's plenty of things in policy out here that people have starkly different views of in public policy. And sometimes people are misinformed. And this is just one of those areas where people have been misinformed. And so what's the big deal? Well, the big deal here is it drives policy. That's obviously a big problem. And it does in other areas as well. But unlike driving policy, there actually are people out here, especially Black Americans, frankly, who have been told by the media, by celebrities, by so many others, you are in danger when you're interacting with law enforcement. You may be killed without justification. That causes people to do things like flee, resist, and do other things that actually do nothing but ramp up the danger to themselves. So I say this not without evidence. All of the police shooting cases that we review, and we do review many of them for, potentially deciding to provide support. I have seen in several cases, incidents where I looked at the whole scenario and I said, I don't think this person is not a criminal. They wound up being involved in a fatal encounter with law enforcement. But if you look at their history and how the incident actually evolved, I don't think they're really a criminal. I think they were afraid that even though this interaction was going to end very peacefully if they just complied, they were afraid that they were going to be harmed or even killed by law enforcement. And that's wound up happening because of the actions they took to try to prevent it. And I think it's just because they had been fed with this. In one particular case I'm thinking about, the reason I think that is that the person who actually wound up being killed by the police, their families, and this person had no criminal history at all. Didn't have a weapon, but it tried to disarm a law enforcement officer. Their family said that this person had been preoccupied with the reports about, supposed police violence and literally lived in fear that they would be killed by the police, even though they were not a criminal and had no reason to have a negative interaction with the police. So look, it's not just the policy part. It really influences the way people behave. And, you can go down a rabbit hole with all of the negative effects of this false belief about law enforcement. And Sean, in upcoming episodes, we're going to dive deeper into different aspects of this, about how this narrative spreads and gains steam. Thank you so much for joining us on Holding the Line, our podcast about cops, courts, and crime. If you're enjoying the podcast, give us a 5-star review, tell your friends, keep the feedback coming. People are sending us emails about one thing or another that they like or they're asking us to cover in the future. And please keep that up. Certainly appreciate it. And join us on the next episode of Holding the Line.